He grabbed her wrist right there at the dinner table, in front of everyone, and said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Sit down, Mara. Nobody asked for your opinion." Her father's grip didn't loosen until she stopped trying to stand. And nobody said a word. Not her mother, not Celeste, not the three ranch hands eating at the far end of the table, who suddenly found their boots very interesting. That was the night Silas Granger came to dinner. And that was the night everything Mara Whitlock had accepted as normal stopped making any kind of sense, because Silas was watching. And unlike every other man who had ever sat at that table, he didn't look away. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear doesn't go where you think it's going. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you stay until the end, I promise you, you will not see that final moment coming. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The Whitlock Ranch sat about 11 miles outside of Calverton, Wyoming, on land that had been in the family for 3 generations, and looked it. The fences needed paint, the barn needed a new roof. The well pump had been making a grinding noise since the previous October, and nobody had fixed it because fixing things cost money the Whitlocks didn't have and never seemed to get around to finding. Mara had been patching that fence line herself since she was 19 years old, not because anyone asked her to, because if she didn't, the cattle drifted and then there was a problem, and somehow the problem always came back to being her fault anyway, so she figured she might as well prevent it in the first place and save herself the trouble of the blame. She was 26 now. Her hands showed it. Celeste's hands did not. Celeste was 23, and Celeste's hands were soft because Celeste was the kind of daughter you kept soft. You kept her out of the sun so her skin stayed clear. You made sure she sat at the good end of the table. You introduced her first when company came. You laughed at her jokes and told her she was clever and bought her the blue dress from the catalog, even when money was tight, because a girl like Celeste needed to look her best because a girl like Celeste was going places. Mara had understood the arithmetic of her family since she was about 12 years old. She wasn't bitter about it the way people assumed she must be. Bitterness takes energy, and Mara didn't have energy to waste on things she couldn't change. She had cattle to feed and accounts to keep and a pump that screamed like a wounded animal every time the pressure dropped. She had made peace with invisibility the way you make peace with bad weather. You don't like it. You don't pretend to like it, but you put your head down and you get through it, and on the other side there's usually something that needs doing. The night Silas Granger came to dinner, Mara had been outside until nearly dark restringing wire on the south pasture fence. She came in with mud on her boots and a cut across her left palm from where the wire had caught her, and she wrapped it with a kitchen rag and didn't say anything about it, because saying something about it would mean explaining what she'd been doing, and that would mean the conversation would eventually circle back to why her father hadn't done it himself, and those conversations never ended well. She heard voices in the front room before she got to the kitchen. A man's voice, low and even, not her father's. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked through to where they were sitting. Her mother perched on the edge of the good chair she only brought out for guests. Her father standing by the fireplace with his chest out the way he stood when he wanted to look like the room belonged to him. And the man on the sofa. Silas Granger was 41 years old and looked like someone who had spent 41 years doing exactly what he wanted and had no particular regrets about any of it. He wasn't handsome the way catalog pictures were handsome. He was something else. Solid. Still. The kind of man who didn't fidget or fill silence with noise, and that alone made him different from almost every man Mara had ever met. She had seen him at county functions. Everyone knew who Silas Granger was. The Granger Ranch ran 12,000 acres southeast of Calverton and employed more people than the next 3 operations combined. He didn't come to many social events, and when he did, he didn't stay long, and people talked about him the way they talked about weather systems, with a mixture of respect and wariness, and the vague sense that whatever he did next would affect them whether they wanted it to or not. He was also, Mara noted from the kitchen doorway, sitting in her house drinking her mother's good coffee and talking to her father like they had an appointment. Nobody had told her he was coming. She turned to go upstairs and change before dinner and nearly walked into Celeste coming the other direction, already dressed in the blue catalog dress, already smelling like the good soap, hair pinned up in a way that had clearly taken considerable effort. "He's here," Celeste said quietly. "I noticed," Mara said. "Do I look all right?" Mara looked at her sister. Celeste's eyes were bright and her cheeks were flushed, and she had that particular expression she got when something was happening that involved her being the center of it. Not quite nervous, not quite smug, something in between that Mara had never quite found the right word for. "You look fine," Mara said. "You always look fine." She meant it without acid. Celeste did always look fine. That was simply a fact of the world. She changed her shirt and washed the mud off her face, and came down to dinner without doing anything particular about her hair because she was hungry, and there was a casserole in the oven, and she had been outside for 6 hours, and she didn't see why any of that should change on account of a man visiting her father. At the table, she sat in her usual spot at the far end, closest to the kitchen, which was where she always sat because it was easiest for her to get up and refill things. Silas sat across from Celeste, which was where a man who had come to look at Celeste would naturally sit, and dinner proceeded the way it always proceeded when company came. Her mother asked polite questions. Her father answered most of them on the company's behalf before the company could answer. Celeste laughed at the right moments and tilted her head in the way that made her look interested and feminine and available. The casserole was decent. The bread was good. Nobody asked Mara anything. She was fine with that. She was watching. She watched the way Silas answered questions. Direct, no embellishment, none of the social puffery most men used when they wanted to impress a room. She watched the way he listened, which was differently from how most people listened. Most people listened with their mouths already open, ready to say their piece as soon as the other person stopped talking. Silas listened with his whole face closed, like he was actually taking something in. She watched him glance at her twice, not at Celeste, at her. The first time she thought she'd imagined it. The second time she put her fork down and looked back, and he didn't look away. And something uncomfortable moved through her chest that she couldn't immediately identify and didn't particularly want to examine. She reached for the bread and knocked her water glass and caught it before it went over, and her father said without looking up from his plate, "Careful, Mara." Like she was 12, like she'd done something careless rather than something quick. She set the glass back down, said nothing, but that was when it happened. She'd been about to say something, she couldn't remember now what exactly, something about the water table on the south pasture, which was relevant to a conversation her father was having with Silas about the property line. And she started to lean forward, started to speak, and her father's hand came across the table and closed around her wrist. Not hard, not violent. That would have at least been honest, just firm enough to stop her, just firm enough to make the point. "Sit down, Mara. Nobody asked for your opinion." The table went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something small and terrible has happened in plain sight. Celeste looked at her plate. Her mother smoothed her napkin. The ranch hands at the far end discovered urgent interest in their boots. Mara sat back, released her own breath, felt the familiar weight of it settle over her like weather, the kind you've stopped bothering to argue with. And then she looked up. Silas Granger was watching her. Not with pity. She had gotten enough pity in her life to recognize it on sight, and she would have hated him for it. Not with embarrassment for her, which was what men usually did when they witnessed something like that. They looked away quickly because witnessing it meant they had to decide whether to say something, and they never wanted to say something. He was watching her with something she couldn't name, something that looked almost like recognition. She looked away first. Dinner finished. Her father showed Silas around the property by lamplight the way men showed other men around property. Arms out, voices expansive, taking credit for things that had simply aged into their current state. Mara washed the dishes. Celeste disappeared upstairs to refresh whatever she'd already refreshed twice. Silas left around 9. Her mother said when the door closed, "He seems very serious." "He's serious money," her father said, and poured himself a drink and went to his chair. Mara dried the last plate and put it away, and went upstairs and lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling, and thought about a man watching her face while her father told her to sit down. And she could not figure out what to make of that, so eventually she stopped trying and went to sleep. That was a Thursday. On Sunday morning, Silas Granger came back. He didn't come for dinner this time. He came in the late morning, and Mara was in the barn when he arrived, replacing a cracked board in the second stall because a horse had kicked it, and the crack was deep enough to be a risk. She heard the truck. She didn't stop what she was doing. She heard the front door. Her mother's voice, high and welcoming. Her father's voice, surprised and pleased. Celeste's footsteps on the stairs. Quick, which meant she had been waiting. Mara went on working. When the barn door opened, she didn't look up. Miss Whitlock? She looked up then. Silas Granger was standing in the barn doorway with the morning light at his back, hat in his hands, which she noticed because men like her father never actually took their hats off inside buildings. They just tilted them. And there was something about the fact that Silas had taken his off completely that registered as meaningful in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. "Mr. Granger," she said. She was still holding the hammer. "Are they expecting you in there?" she asked. "Yes." "Then why are you in here?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the cracked board she was repairing, at the nails she'd already set, at the way she'd braced the new wood against her knee to hold it at the right angle. He looked at all of that the way someone looks at something they already knew was there. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. Before I go in and talk to your father." She set the hammer down on the hay bale beside her and straightened up and looked at him. He was looking at her the same way he had at dinner. That closed, taking-it-in look that she had decided she found unsettling in a way that was not entirely unpleasant and was mostly just confusing. "There was a storm," he said, "third week of March. Bad one. Came through around 2 in the morning. She remembered it. A brutal spring storm, the kind that came out of the northwest and didn't care what it damaged. "I know the one," she said. "My property runs along your south pasture," he said. "I was out checking my fence line when it came through. I saw a light in your barn." Mara said nothing. "I saw what you did," he said, "with the calf." She felt something shift in her chest. Not embarrassment exactly, something more complicated. That night had been bad. A first-year heifer down in labor, and the calf malpresented and the storm screaming outside, and her father asleep and her not wanting to wake anyone because she had handled things before and she would handle this. And 2 hours of work that she didn't want to think too carefully about, and at the end of it, a calf standing on shaking legs, and a heifer too exhausted to do anything but breathe. She had never told anyone about that night. There was nothing to tell. She had done what needed doing. "You were watching," she said, "not on purpose. I sheltered from the storm in your tree line. I could see through the barn window." He paused. "I stayed because I didn't know if you needed help." "I didn't." "No," he said. "You didn't." He looked at her for a long moment. She had the strange and disorienting sensation of being looked at, not observed, not assessed, not measured against some other standard, but actually looked at, the way you look at something you want to understand. "I'm going to go in that house and talk to your father," Silas said. "And I want you to know, before I do, that it's not going to be the conversation he's expecting." Mara felt the bottom of her stomach do something she hadn't asked it to do. "What conversation is he expecting?" she asked, though she already knew. "The one about Celeste," Silas said. He said it plainly. No apology in it, no cruelty either, just a fact he was laying out on the workbench between them. "That's what everyone's expecting, including your sister." "Yes," Mara said. "I know. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to hear it first," he said. "From me, not from across a dinner table when you're not expecting it." Her heart was doing something strange and alarming. She pressed her palms against her thighs and kept her face the way she had learned to keep her face, still giving nothing away. "What do you want, Mr. Granger?" she asked. "To ask if you're willing to hear what I'm proposing," he said, "before I say it in there. So you can tell me right now if the answer is no. And if it is, I'll get back in my truck and you never have to see me again." She looked at him for a long time. The barn around her was familiar. The smell of hay and leather and animal warmth, the particular weight of morning light through the gaps in the boards. She had spent half her life in this barn. She knew every sound it made. "Say it," she said. "I'm not looking for a decoration," he said. "I've been running that ranch alone for 11 years, and I'm tired of it, and I need a partner. Not someone to put at the head of the table, someone who knows what a calving emergency looks like at 2 in the morning and handles it without waking up the house." He stopped. "I think you know how to build something. I've watched you long enough to believe that, and I'm asking if you want to build it with me." The silence in the barn was the loudest thing Mara had heard in a long time. "You don't know me," she said. I know more than you think, he said. One storm, she said, one night through a window. And 3 years of county meetings, he said, and the way you kept your face when your father silenced you at that table, and the way your accounts balanced last year when your father's didn't, which I know because I asked around. He paused. I'm not making a hasty decision, Miss Whitlock. Her throat felt strange. She made herself breathe. If I said yes, she said, and even forming the words felt dangerous. What exactly would that mean? What would it look like? Equal ownership from day one, he said. Half the deed in your name before we sign anything. Equal vote on every decision. Your own authority in the areas you take responsibility for. He looked at her steadily. And I will never do what your father did at that table. Not once. Not ever. If I do, you can walk with your half, and I'll deserve to lose it. The air between them was very still. Mara Whitlock had spent 26 years waiting for someone to see her. She had not spent those years expecting to be seen by someone like this, or in a place like this, or on a Sunday morning with hay in her hair and a hammer by her hand. She had also spent 26 years learning to trust her own judgment about what was real and what wasn't. And something in her, the same part of her that knew when a heifer was in trouble before the signs were obvious to anyone else, was telling her that Silas Granger meant exactly what he said. You'll talk to my father today? She said. Right now, he said, if your answer is yes. She looked at the cracked board she'd been repairing. She looked at the nails she'd set, the line she'd kept straight by eye without measuring it, the work she'd done without thinking much about it because it was simply what needed doing. She picked up the hammer. Tell him, she said, that you didn't come for Celeste. Something moved across his face that might have been relief or might have been something else entirely. She would have time later to figure out which. He put his hat back on and walked back toward the house. Mara drove the nail home in one clean swing. And then she stood there in the barn that had been the only world she'd ever really been allowed to own, listening to the door of her father's house open and close. And she thought about what her life had been and what it might become. And she was terrified in a way she hadn't been since the night of that storm, alone in the dark, doing something nobody had asked her to do, with no guarantee it would work, and everything on the line if it didn't. Inside, she could hear voices. Then she heard her father's voice rise. A single word, sharp and disbelieving. Then silence. Then nothing for a long time. She stayed where she was. She had learned a long time ago that the hardest thing about being the woman no one ever chose was not the choosing itself. It was the waiting in the spaces between decisions, in the quiet that came after something irreversible had been said, with nothing to hold on to but your own certainty that you had made the right call. She was still holding the hammer. She held on. The voices inside the house went on for a long time. Mara could hear the rhythm of it from the barn even if she couldn't make out the words. Her father's voice climbing and falling the way it did when he was trying to control something that wasn't cooperating. Her mother's voice underneath that, higher and thinner, the sound of a woman trying to smooth something that wasn't going to be smoothed. And Silas. She could barely hear Silas at all, which told her more than the other two voices combined. Quiet men in arguments don't lose their quiet. They just let the noise around them exhaust itself. She finished the board. She replaced 2 more that she'd been putting off for a week. She checked the water trough in the 3rd stall and found the valve had been dripping again and fixed that too, because standing still was not something she was particularly good at when her mind was doing what her mind was currently doing. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that in a grim, private way. It was close to 40 minutes before she heard the front door and then boot steps on the gravel, and she made herself not look up from what she was doing, which was now straightening a saddle rack that had been crooked for so long it had practically become architecture, until the boot steps stopped outside the barn door. It was her father. He stood in the doorway the same way Silas had stood in it earlier, except her father never took his hat off, and he was gripping the doorframe with one hand in a way that suggested the doorframe was doing something useful for him right now. His face was a complicated thing. She had spent 26 years reading her father's face, and she knew most of its expressions the way you know the sounds an old house makes, which creaks meant nothing and which ones meant something was shifting in the foundation. This expression she had seen before, but not often. It was the face he made when something had happened that he hadn't been able to prevent and hadn't been able to talk his way around and was now stuck having to live with. "He wants to marry you," her father said. He said it the way you'd report a hailstorm. A fact. An unwelcome one. "I know," Mara said. Her father's hand tightened on the doorframe. "You knew." "He told me this morning, before he came inside." Something moved through her father's face. Not quite anger, not quite something else. A shifting of layers that she didn't have time to sort out before he pressed it down. "Why would he—" He stopped, started again. "He said he'd been watching you, for months." He said the word watching like it had a bad smell to it. Said he saw you with the Hendersons' stray calf in the storm. Said that was when he— Another stop. Her father took off his hat, which he almost never did, and turned it in his hands. "I don't understand it, Mara." It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in years. She looked at him. She thought about saying something direct. Something about 26 years of not understanding her, about not looking at what was in front of him, about the water pump and the fence and the accounts and the long litany of things she had done that had simply been absorbed into the landscape of the ranch without anyone attaching her name to them. She thought about saying all of that. She didn't. Not because she was afraid of him. She had stopped being afraid of her father somewhere around age 19 and had mostly just been managing him since. She didn't say it because it wouldn't help. Not today. Today there was only one thing that mattered. "What did you tell him?" she said. Her father looked at his hat. "Told him I needed to speak to you first." That surprised her. She didn't let it show. "And Celeste?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "Celeste is upset." "I imagine she is." She'd been expecting— "I know what she'd been expecting," Mara said. "What do you want to do, Daddy?" She used the word deliberately. She hadn't called him that in a long time. She watched it land on him and watched him try to decide what to do with it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, not looking at her, "He's offering a fair arrangement. More than fair, if the deed terms are what he described." "They are," Mara said. "You've already discussed the terms." "We discussed what he intended to offer, yes." Her father looked up at her then, really looked at her the way Silas had looked at her, except without the steadiness of it, with something more fractured, more uncomfortable, the look of a man trying to see something clearly that he had spent a long time deliberately not looking at. "You sure about this?" he asked. It was not an expression of care, not exactly, but it was something, a question he actually wanted the answer to, which was rare enough that she treated it with respect. "Yes," she said. He put his hat back on, nodded once, went back inside. Mara stood in the barn for another minute. Then she walked to the house. Celeste was in the kitchen. She had taken her hair down, and it was around her shoulders, and her eyes were red in a way she hadn't bothered to fix, which told Mara more than a dramatic scene would have. Her sister was genuinely hurt, not performing hurt, and there was a difference, and Mara knew it. She sat down across from her sister at the kitchen table, the table where they had eaten every meal of their lives, the table where their father had silenced her in front of Silas Granger 3 days ago. "Say it," Mara said. "Whatever you need to say." Celeste looked at her for a long moment. Her hands were flat on the table. "How long?" "How long what?" "How long have you been talking to him?" "I spoke to him for the first time this morning," Mara said. "For about 10 minutes. In the barn." Celeste's expression shifted, doubt moving through it, and then something harder to name. "In the barn. He came to find me before he came inside. He wanted me to hear it from him first." Celeste laughed. It was not a happy sound. "Of course he did." She pressed her fingers against the tabletop. "Do you know how long I've been—" She stopped. "Mama's been telling me for 2 months that this was happening, that he was interested, that it was only a matter of time." "I didn't know that," Mara said. "No," Celeste said. "You wouldn't." She looked up. "You were outside. You're always outside." Mara held her sister's gaze. Celeste, I'm not going to apologize for this. I'm not asking you to. A pause. I don't know what I'm asking. Another pause, longer. I don't even know if I liked him that much. I think I just... She stopped again, and what came through in the silence was something Mara recognized. The particular grief of losing something you'd built a whole future around in your head, even if that future had always been imaginary. I know, Mara said quietly. Celeste looked at her hands. You're actually going to say yes. I already did. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He looked at you at dinner. I saw him. I didn't know what to make of it at the time. She shook her head slowly. I thought he was just being polite. Maybe he was, Mara said. He wasn't, Celeste said, and there was something in the way she said it, flat and factual, that sounded more like her actual self than anything else she'd said in the conversation. Her sister was not stupid. She had simply been pointed in a particular direction her whole life, and had walked that way because nobody had suggested any other. The town of Calverton heard about the engagement in the way small towns hear about things, not from the people involved, but from the spaces in between them. Someone had seen Silas's truck at the Whitlock Ranch on a Sunday morning. Someone else had heard from the feed store clerk who heard from the Whitlock Ranch hand who'd been in the barn an hour after it happened that something had been said and it wasn't what anybody expected. By Tuesday, the story had traveled to every table in the Calverton diner and most of the pews of the two churches and the entire length of the hardware store's counter. By Wednesday, it had mutated into something only loosely related to reality. But the core of it held because the core of it was strange enough to survive in its original form. Silas Granger had chosen Mara Whitlock, not Celeste. Mara. Mara heard the first version of the county's response from Ruth Haber, who was 64 years old and had run the post office for 30 of those years and operated as Calverton's most reliable information exchange. Ruth handed Mara her mail on Wednesday morning with the particular expression of a woman delivering both correspondence and subtext. People are talking, Ruth said. People always talk, Mara said. They're saying... Ruth paused, as if choosing her words, which was not something Ruth typically did. They're saying he made a mistake. Mara looked up from the mail. Is that right? She said. Harlan Busby said it at breakfast yesterday. Said Silas has gone soft or strange or both. Said a man in his position needs someone who can represent the ranch at social functions, not... Ruth stopped. Not what? Mara said, keeping her voice level. Ruth had the grace to look uncomfortable. His words were something like, not a woman who smells like a barn. Mara was quiet for a moment. What did you say to Harlan Busby? I told him his opinion was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine, Ruth said, and that he'd better not let Silas Granger hear him say it unless he wanted his grazing lease renegotiated. Mara smiled despite herself. Ruth smiled back, and there was something in it, a private, particular thing between two women who had both spent time being underestimated in rooms that held them in low regard. Thank you, Ruth, Mara said. Don't thank me, Ruth said. Just do something remarkable so I can tell people I knew you when. The engagement was set for 6 weeks. The wedding itself was small by the county's standards. Not because Silas was being modest, but because Mara had asked for small, and he had not argued, which told her something she filed away alongside everything else she was filing about him. She was building a picture, piece by piece, of what kind of man she was going to spend her life with, and she was aware that she was doing it with incomplete information and that the remaining gaps would have to be filled in later by living with him, and that this was terrifying in a way she mostly kept to herself. The night before the wedding, her mother came to her room. She knocked first, which she rarely did, and sat on the edge of the bed with the stiff posture of a woman who had something to say that she'd been rehearsing. Your father should have, she started. Mama, Mara said. You don't have to. I want to, her mother said. Her hands were in her lap, folded, unfolded, folded again. You did everything here. The accounts, the fence, the cattle, everything. I see that. I always saw it. Mara looked at her mother. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's hands, and she had spent years wondering which of them she actually was. "Then why didn't you ever say anything?" she asked. Not accusatory, just the question, plain. Her mother's hand stilled. "Because saying it would have meant saying the other thing," she said. "About Celeste. About how we—" She stopped. "I don't know how to explain that without making it worse." "You don't have to explain it," Mara said. "I just want you to know that I'm proud of you," her mother said. "Properly proud. Not the way I say I'm proud of Celeste because she wore a nice dress to a function. The other way." Mara looked at her hands. The cut from the wire had healed to a thin scar across her left palm. It would probably always be there. "Thank you," she said. Her mother patted her knee once, awkwardly, and stood up and went to the door, and then stopped. "He's a good man," she said. "I think. Hard to know for certain, but I think." "I think so too," Mara said. "I'm going to find out." Her mother nodded, closed the door behind her. Mara sat in the dark for a while. Then she packed the last of her things. The wedding was on a Saturday in May. 12 people. A judge from Laramie who Silas knew from a property dispute settlement 3 years earlier. A few ranch hands from the Granger operation who stood in the back with their hats in their hands. Ruth Haber, who had not been invited but showed up anyway, and nobody had the nerve to ask her to leave. Celeste, who stood beside their mother and kept her face composed in the careful way of someone who has made a private decision to be decent about something they find painful, which Mara respected more than she would have respected easy happiness. Silas said his vows without looking at the judge. He looked at Mara. She said hers, looking back. They signed the documents. The deed transfer had already been filed. Silas had insisted on that first, before the ceremony, before anything. He'd handed her the copy himself, in the lawyer's office on Thursday, without making a speech about it. Just slid it across the desk and said, "That's yours now, regardless of anything else." She had looked at her name on the deed, Mara Whitlock Granger, and had pressed her thumbnail into her palm to make sure she was awake. She had been awake. The drive to the Granger ranch afterward was 40 minutes in Silas's truck with the windows cracked. They didn't talk much. That might have felt strange with someone else. With Silas, it felt like the natural continuation of the silence they'd been building since the barn. A silence that had weight to it. Not emptiness, but content. The kind that meant something was there even when nothing was being said. Halfway there, she said, "I'm going to need to understand the accounts before I can tell you where the waste is." He glanced at her. "All right. And I want to talk to the hands myself, not through you, myself." "Agreed. And the supplier contracts. Someone's been overcharging you on feed delivery. I could see it from the numbers in the county records." He was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been looking at my county records?" "About a year," she said. "I look at everyone's. It's public record." Another pause. "You're right about the feed," he said. "Benton Brothers. We've been with them since my father's time, and I never renegotiated the rate." "We will," she said. "Yes," he said. "We will." The ranch came into view around a long curve in the road, and she looked at it properly for the first time. Had seen it from the road before. Everyone had, but never from this angle, never coming toward it like it was a destination rather than something you drove past. It was large. That was the first impression. Not grand. There was nothing showy about it. The buildings were plain and functional, the kind of thing built by people who cared about durability more than appearance. But it was large, and it was ordered, and it sat in the land like it had been there long enough to become part of it. 12,000 acres, she said. 12,400, he said. The north parcel I bought in 2019 rounded it up. And you've been running it alone. Mostly. I have good people. But the decisions, he paused. Yeah, mostly alone. She looked at the land rolling away to either side of the road. 12,400 acres of it. The south pasture alone was bigger than her father's entire property. She was not overwhelmed. She was something else. The feeling she got sometimes when a problem was so large and clear that she could already see the shape of it, could already feel herself starting to work out where to begin. Not excitement exactly, more like recognition. "Tell me about the water situation on the east parcels," she said. Silas looked at her, and this time the thing on his face was unmistakable. It was exactly what she'd seen that night at the dinner table. Not pity, not assessment, not any of the expressions men usually turned on her. It was the look of someone who had been waiting a long time to have a particular kind of conversation and was relieved that the wait was over. "The East Parcel water is a mess," he said. "Goes back to a dispute with the Crow family in 1987. Never fully resolved." "Walk me through it," she said. He did. He talked for the remaining 20 minutes of the drive, and she asked 7 questions, most of which stopped him mid-sentence because they cut directly to the part he hadn't finished explaining yet. And by the time they pulled into the yard, she had the shape of the problem in her mind and 2 ideas about how to approach it and a list of documents she needed to see before Monday. They got out of the truck. One of the hands, a weathered man in his 50s named Cal, who she would later learn had been with Silas for 16 years and had a deeply skeptical view of anything that disrupted routine, looked at them coming across the yard and looked at Mara with the particular expression of a man who has not fully accepted that a change is happening and is not yet sure what to do about that. She met his eyes directly, didn't smile, didn't try to win anything, just held his gaze until he nodded once and went back to what he was doing. Silas, beside her, didn't say anything. She was glad he didn't. The first week was strange in the specific way that first weeks inside any new world are strange. Too much information coming too fast, no established patterns yet for any of it, the constant low-level work of learning the language of a place. Which hinges needed grease, which route through the east pasture was actually faster than the one on the map, which of the hands took direction without commentary, and which needed to understand the reasoning behind a thing before they'd commit to it. The rhythms of a working ranch she already knew. The rhythms of this particular ranch she had to learn from the ground up. She made mistakes. Not major ones, but she made them, and she didn't hide from them. The first Thursday, she misjudged the timing on a rotation, and 2 pastures that should have been rested an extra day weren't, and she went to Silas and told him plainly what she'd gotten wrong and what she was going to do differently. He listened, didn't minimize it, didn't tell her not to worry about it, which she would have hated. Said, "The North Field has been forgiving, should recover fast." And then, "The judgment call you made on the Henderson Gate made up for it. That saved us 3 days' work." She looked at him. "You noticed that?" "I notice most things," he said. "So do I," she said. Something settled between them in that moment. Not romance, not yet. Something earlier than that. The specific alignment of 2 people who recognize each other's way of moving through the world and feel, for possibly the first time, that they have met someone operating on the same frequency. It was 2 weeks into the marriage when the county showed up. Not literally, not all at once. But Calverton had many ways of making its opinion known without formal announcement, and the Grangers, or the fact of the Grangers, the fact of who and what Mara now was, had apparently activated most of them. Invitations to social events that Silas had always been included in began arriving with small, pointed changes. The wording a little more formal, the expectations a little more specific, what to wear, what would be served. The subtext of all of it being, there will be standards. Please be aware of the standards. 3 separate women from the County Wives Association came to call on Mara in the first 2 weeks. She received them each in the front room and served them coffee and listened to them talk about things that were not the thing they had actually come to talk about. The appropriate attire for the summer social, the tradition of the harvest table, the composition of the flower arrangements at the county fundraiser, until eventually each conversation arrived, by slightly different routes, at the same destination. The destination was, what kind of woman was she going to be? Dorothy Marsh, who was 67 and had been the unelected social authority of Calverton since approximately the Eisenhower administration, said it most directly. She sat in the front room with her coffee held perfectly level and looked at Mara with eyes that had spent decades sorting people into columns. "Silas has always been an asset to this county," she said. "We expect the same from his household." "I expect the same," Mara said. Dorothy's eyes moved over her. The work clothes she hadn't had time to change out of, the hair she dealt with practically rather than ornamentally, the hands that could not be disguised. "The summer social is in 6 weeks," Dorothy said. "It would be a good opportunity for a proper introduction." "I'll be there," Mara said. "It's a formal event," Dorothy said. I understand formal, Mara said pleasantly. Dorothy looked at her for a moment longer, the look of a woman recalibrating. She had come, Mara suspected, expecting to find someone easily managed. What she was finding instead was something else, and she wasn't yet sure what to do with it. She left without achieving whatever she'd actually come for. Mara went back to work. Silas found her in the office that evening, surrounded by supplier invoices going back 4 years. Dorothy Marsh was here, he said from the doorway. Yes, Mara said, without looking up. How did it go? Fine, she said. She pulled out an invoice from Benton Brothers and put it on top of the pile she'd been building since the drive from the wedding. Come look at this. He came over and looked. They've been billing you for 40-pound bags, she said, and delivering 35s, consistently, since 2021. Silas was quiet for a moment. You're certain? I cross-referenced it with 3 other suppliers' weights and the hand's daily feeding logs. Cal keeps good logs. She looked up. We're owed somewhere around $4,000 in product or credit, and I want the rate renegotiated before we pay them another invoice. Silas sat down in the chair across from her. He was looking at the invoices, but also at her, the way she'd noticed he did, tracking 2 things at once. I'll call them Monday, he said. I'd like to be on the call, she said. He looked at her. All right. I won't undercut you, she said. I just want them to know it's not just you looking at the numbers anymore. I know you won't undercut me, he said. He said it simply, like it wasn't a compliment, like it was just the thing he actually thought, which was the best kind of way to say something. She looked back at the invoices. How long has the water dispute with Crow been sitting in the county files unresolved? 11 years. Has anyone actually read the 1987 deed language? Silas paused. I have a lawyer who... Has your lawyer read the original 1987 deed language, she said, or just the 1994 summary of it? Another pause. Longer this time. I don't know, he said. I want to look at the original, she said. I'll get you access to the county archive, he said. She nodded and pulled another invoice toward her. Outside the window, the ranch was going quiet in the way it went quiet at the end of the day, the sounds settling down to the essential ones, the wind in the grass, the distant movement of cattle, the particular silence of a working place at rest. It was the loudest silence she had ever lived in. She was starting to understand that it was going to take some getting used to. Not the quiet. The feeling of being somewhere she was actually supposed to be. That feeling, unfamiliar and disorienting and not entirely comfortable yet, was what she took with her when she finally closed the last invoice, turned off the office light, and went to find out what the rest of her life was going to look like. The county could think what it wanted. She had work to do. The original 1987 deed was in worse shape than she'd expected. Not physically. The county archive kept things well enough. Folders in acid-free sleeves, filed in order, the way bureaucracies that have survived long enough develop their own kind of institutional pride. The document itself was intact. The problem was what was in it. Mara sat at the long table in the county clerk's back room on a Tuesday morning with the deed spread in front of her and a yellow legal pad beside it, and worked through the language slowly, the way she worked through anything she wasn't certain of, not rushing toward the conclusion she expected to find, but reading what was actually there. The clerk, a young man named Davis, who had initially offered to help her locate things with the slightly patronizing efficiency of someone used to members of the public not knowing what they were looking for, had retreated to his desk after she'd asked him 3 questions he couldn't answer and had been quiet ever since. The 1987 deed established water access rights along the eastern creek bed, shared between the Granger property and what had then been the Crow family's western parcel. The language was specific in some places and maddening in others. The kind of legal drafting that happened when 2 parties with competing interests each tried to insert their own protections into a single document and ended up with something that could legitimately be read 3 ways, depending on which paragraph you started from. The 1994 summary her husband's lawyer had been working from had taken one of those 3 readings and treated it as definitive. It was not the reading that favored the Granger position. It was also, Mara was nearly certain after 90 minutes with the original, not the most defensible reading of the actual language. She wrote 4 pages of notes. She asked Davis for copies of 2 supplementary documents he had to dig for. She thanked him without warmth and drove back to the ranch and put everything on the desk in the office and called Silas in from the east pasture. He came in with mud on his boots and looked at the spread of papers and said, "What did you find?" "Your lawyer has been working from a summary that misread the original," she said. "The access rights aren't as limited as he told you. The creekbed language in Section 4 supports a shared use interpretation, not exclusive Crow access, but it requires a specific filing with the county water board to activate it. Nobody filed it in 1987 because the dispute was still informal at that point, and nobody has filed it since because everyone has been arguing about the 1994 summary instead of going back to the source." Silas looked at the papers, then at her. "You got all that in one morning?" "I got the shape of it," she said. "I'm not a lawyer. We need someone to look at this who actually is one, not the one you've been using." "Well, why not the one I've been using?" "Because he's been telling you for 11 years that this position is indefensible," she said, "and I want someone who will look at the original language fresh, someone who doesn't already have a conclusion." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I know someone in Cheyenne." "Call her," Mara said. A pause. "It's a him." "Call him," she said. The lawyer from Cheyenne came out the following week. His name was Patterson, and he was 60-something and deliberate in the way of people who had learned to be very sure before they said anything out loud. He read the original 1987 deed and the supplementary documents Mara had pulled and her 4 pages of notes with the same steady, unrevealing expression throughout, and then he took off his glasses and set them on the table. "This is a legitimate argument," he said. "Can we win it?" Silas asked. "Depends what you mean by win," Patterson said. "Take it to court, and it could go either way. Crow's family has money, and they'll hire someone good. But file the water board claim first, which you're entitled to do under the original language, and you change the negotiating position entirely. Suddenly they're the ones fighting to reverse an established filing instead of you fighting to assert one that's never existed." "How long to file?" Mara asked. 3 weeks if I move on it," Patterson said. "Move on it," Silas said. Patterson looked at Mara across the table. "You found this." "I read the original document," she said. "That's all." "Your husband's previous counsel had access to the same document." "Yes," she said. Patterson put his glasses back on. "I'll start Monday." After he left, Silas stood in the doorway of the office for a moment. He had an expression she'd been seeing more of lately, something that sat between impressed and unsettled, like a man who had expected to be surprised but was still surprised anyway, every time, because the surprise was larger than anticipated. 11 years, he said. "The answer was in the file the whole time," she said. "It just needed someone to read it without already knowing what they expected to find." He nodded slowly, didn't say anything else. But when he left the room, he left differently than he'd entered it. Lighter, maybe, or something adjacent to that, like a man who had been carrying something heavy and had just set one end of it down. The water board filing went in 3 weeks later. Victor Crow called the ranch within 48 hours. Mara happened to be the one who answered the phone. She had been in the office going through the revised feed supplier contract. She and Silas had done the Benton brothers call together, and Benton himself had been smooth and apologetic in the practiced way of a man who had been caught and was experienced at being caught and had a whole routine prepared for the occasion, and they had come away with a credit for $3,800 and a new rate schedule, and she had filed the signed copy and moved directly to the next thing on her list, which was how she moved through most days now. The phone rang. She picked it up. "I need to speak to Silas Granger," said the voice on the other end. Male, somewhere in his 60s, with the controlled edge of a man who was angry and was holding it with both hands. "He's in the south pasture," Mara said. "This is his wife. Can I help you?" A pause. "His wife." "Mara Granger," she said. Another pause, slightly longer. She had been Victor Crow's neighbor by marriage for 8 weeks at this point, and had not yet met him in person, but she had read everything about him that was publicly available, which was considerable. He was 71. He had inherited his ranch from his father and had added to it aggressively through his 50s and early 60s through a combination of good timing and willingness to apply pressure to struggling neighbors. He sat on the county water board, which was part of why the Granger water claim had never been filed. The previous assumption had been that Crow could block it from inside the process. Patterson had found a procedural route around that. Crow would know it now. "Mrs. Granger," Crow said, with the specific emphasis of a man using a title ironically. "Tell your husband I'd like a meeting." "What kind of meeting?" she said. "The kind where we discuss this water board filing before it becomes a problem for both of us." "It's not a problem for us," she said. A brief silence. "You might want to let your husband assess that." "We assess things together," she said. "That's how our operation works. Would you like to schedule the meeting with me, or would you prefer to call back?" The silence that followed was different from the ones before, longer, with something in it she recognized. It was the silence of a man recalibrating, like Dorothy Marsh in the front room, like Harlan Busby before Ruth Haber had shut him down. The silence of someone who had arrived with a particular set of expectations about what they were dealing with and was finding that the ground had shifted. "I'll come to the ranch," Crow said finally. "Thursday." 2:00, she said. "I'll make sure Silas is available." She hung up and sat for a moment with her hand still on the receiver. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the feed contract. She told Silas at dinner. He listened and then said, "He asked for you specifically, or did he just end up with you?" "He ended up with me," she said, "but he agreed to meet with me present. He knows I'm involved." Silas was quiet. "Victor Crow has been dealing with ranchers in this county for 40 years, he said. "He's very good at reading people and then using what he reads." "I know," she said. "He'll try to talk around you if he thinks he can." "He can try," she said. Silas looked at her across the dinner table. "Do you want me to take the lead on Thursday, or do you?" She considered it. "Let's start together and see where he goes." "All right." Thursday came with a cold wind off the northeast that felt more like March than late May, and Victor Crow arrived 12 minutes late, which was the first move, the kind of petty opening gambit that men who measured power in increments used to establish that your time mattered less than theirs. Mara had made coffee, but did not offer it immediately, which was the counter. He was a large man. Not soft large, but solid large, the kind of build that had been physical in its youth and had settled into authority in its age. He shook Silas's hand with the comfortable ease of men who had known each other for decades and shared the specific shorthand of people who had competed and occasionally cooperated without ever fully trusting each other. He shook Mara's hand too, but briefly and without looking at her directly, which told her exactly where she stood in his assessment of the room. They sat. She poured coffee. Crow began. He was good. She had expected him to be good. And he opened on common ground. The shared history of the two ranches, the long-standing nature of their various disputes and cooperations, the importance of neighbor relationships in a county this size. He was warm about it, almost nostalgic, and she could see how it had worked on people before. The sense that you were being brought into a community, a shared understanding, and that the reasonable thing to do was to meet him inside that understanding and work from there. The implication of all of it was that the water board filing was a disruption, an aggression, something a good neighbor wouldn't do. Silas was listening with his neutral face, the closed one. She was watching Crow. When Crow paused to take a breath, she said, "The 1987 deed establishes shared access rights. The filing simply activates what was already there. Can you tell me where you see the disruption?" Crow looked at her, not dismissively. He was too experienced for that, but with a slight recalibration, the way a man shifts his weight when the floor isn't quite level where he expected it to be. "The practical use of that creek bed has been established over 30 years, he said, redirecting toward her now that she'd engaged. "Shared access means shared maintenance, shared cost. We've been carrying that alone. Your family has been using approximately 80% of the water flow for 30 years, she said. We have the county irrigation records. If we're discussing shared maintenance cost, we'd need to talk about shared usage credit going back to 1994, which is when the current use pattern was established. That's a different conversation than the one I think you came here to have." The room was very quiet. Silas had not moved. Crow looked at her with the full attention he hadn't given her when he walked in, and there was something in it now that was not quite anger and not quite respect, but was moving in the direction of one of them. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been reading," she said. "The records are public." Patterson put you up to this analysis, he said. Patterson is filing the legal claim, she said. The analysis is mine. Another silence. Crow set his coffee cup down with the careful deliberateness of a man who was thinking faster than his face was showing. What do you want? He said. And this time he said it to her, not to Silas. She noticed that. She thought Silas noticed it too. What we're entitled to under the original agreement, she said. Proportional access. Shared maintenance going forward, proportional to use. No retroactive claim on the past 30 years. That would be expensive and unpleasant for everyone, and we're not interested in expensive and unpleasant. She paused. We'd like a neighbor agreement, not a lawsuit. Crow looked at her for a long moment. That's a generous offer. It's a fair offer, she said. There's a difference. He looked at Silas. Your wife is direct. Yes, Silas said. You're letting her lead this. She found the issue, Silas said. She knows it better than I do. Crow looked between them with an expression that was clearly recalibrating something, some assumption he'd carried into the room that wasn't surviving contact with what was actually in it. He was not accustomed to this. She could see that plainly. He was accustomed to wives who refreshed the coffee and deferred to their husbands on matters of substance, and he was sitting across from something that didn't match that template, and he was old enough and experienced enough to know that the thing to do when your template doesn't match reality is to adjust the template, not insist on it. I'll need to consult with my own counsel, he said. Of course, Mara said. Patterson is ready to proceed whenever you are. We'd prefer to resolve this outside of court. He left without the concessions he'd come for. He also left, Mara thought, with a different understanding of what he was dealing with than the one he'd arrived with. The meeting had lasted 51 minutes, she'd checked. Cal was crossing the yard when Crow's truck pulled out. He watched it go. Then he looked at the house. He'd been in earshot of nothing. The walls were solid, but he had the instincts of a man who had spent decades reading the meaning of how people walk to and from buildings. When Mara came out 20 minutes later to check on the afternoon rotation, he was mending a section of gate hinge nearby and didn't look up. Crow leave empty-handed? He said. We had a productive conversation, she said. Cal grunted. It was, she had learned, the sound he made when he was amending his opinion of something and didn't want to make a production of it. He give you trouble? Cal said. He tried, she said. Cal looked up from the hinge. His face was the kind of face that had spent 40 years outdoors doing honest work and showed all of it, and whatever he was thinking now was somewhere in the middle of a long revision that had been going on since she arrived. He's not used to being told no, Cal said. Neither am I, she said. Something moved through Cal's expression that might, in another man, have been a smile. In Cal, it was just a slight easing of the permanent furrow between his brows. He went back to the hinge. She went to check on the rotation. 3 days after Crow's visit, the letter arrived. It came in the morning mail, which Ruth Haber would have seen the return address on because Ruth saw every return address. And Mara would hear later from Ruth that she had held it longer than was technically necessary to sort it and had set it in the outgoing tray with a particular expression. The return address was a law office in Calverton, not Patterson's office. It was addressed to Mara Granger. She opened it at the kitchen table while Silas was still outside. It took her 2 readings to understand what she was looking at. The legal language was dense, but she worked through it steadily, and what emerged from beneath the language was this. Her father had filed a petition with the county to contest the deed transfer that had put her name on the Granger Ranch. The grounds were procedural. He claimed she had been under undue influence at the time of signing. The petition requested a hearing to review the legitimacy of the transfer. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The morning was quiet around her. Somewhere outside, Cal was talking to one of the younger hands about something to do with the water trough in the north field. A bird was doing something repetitive in the tree nearest the window. The coffee she'd made earlier was still on the counter, gone cold while she'd been reading. She thought about her father at the dinner table, his hand on her wrist. Nobody asked for your opinion. She thought about this conversation in the barn on Sunday morning, her father's face when he'd said, I don't understand it, Mara. The way he'd looked at her like she was a stranger who had replaced his daughter, and he wasn't sure when the replacement had happened. She thought about her mother sitting on the edge of her bed the night before the wedding. I always saw it. The letter said undue influence, which meant, in the language the law used for these things, that her father was claiming Silas had pressured her, manipulated her, that she had not been capable of making the decision herself, that she had needed someone to folded the letter, put it in the pocket of her jacket, and went outside to find her husband. He was in the east paddock going over a fence line with Cal. She waited until she could catch his eye, and he came over and she handed him the letter without saying anything. She watched him read it. She watched his face do things while he read it. When he finished, he looked up and his eyes were doing something she hadn't seen from him before. A heat in them, a tightly controlled anger, the kind that sat under a very deliberate stillness, the way a fire sits under a layer of ash. "He filed this 3 days ago," Silas said. "It would have been right around when he heard about the Crow meeting," she said. "Ruth sees everything." Silas looked at the letter again. "I can have Patterson." "No," she said. He looked at her. "I'm going to talk to my father," she said. "Mara." "Myself," she said. "Not through a lawyer, not with you standing behind me." She held his gaze. "I need to do this myself." He held the letter out to her. She took it back. He looked at her for a long moment with that same closed, reading expression he had been turning on her since the barn in March, and she waited for him to say the thing most men would say, that it was too complicated, that it was a legal matter, that he should come with her, that she needed backup, that she needed him. He said none of it. "Take the truck," he said. "The highway's better than the county road today." She drove to her father's ranch with the letter on the seat beside her, and the window cracked the same way it had been on the drive from their wedding, and the land going past was the same land, but she was not the same person who had driven it 8 weeks ago. She had not been the same person for a while. She had been becoming different slowly for years, and the last 8 weeks had simply been the part where it became visible. Her father was on the porch when she pulled in. He saw the truck and knew it wasn't Silas's usual reason for visiting, which was no reason at all. He stayed where he was. She got out, walked to the porch, stood at the bottom of the steps, and looked up at him. He looked older than she remembered. She had been 8 weeks away from him, and he had aged in it somehow, or maybe he had always looked like this, and she had been too close to him for too long to see it clearly. She took the letter out of her pocket and held it up. "I want you to explain this to me," she said. Her father looked at the letter. He didn't reach for it. "The lawyer said—" "I don't want to hear what the lawyer said," she said. "I want to hear what you said. Why you walked into a law office and told someone that your daughter needed to be protected from her own decisions." He was quiet. "I've been making decisions for this family since I was 19 years old," she said. "I kept the accounts. I fixed the fence. I did the calving when you were asleep. I kept that ranch alive for years while everyone acted like it was running itself. And not once, not one single time, did you walk into a lawyer's office and say, 'Wait, maybe she shouldn't have to do that alone.'" She stopped. "But this you wanted to intervene in." Her father's jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides. "He's a powerful man," her father said. "Granger, he could have—" "Daddy." She said it the same way she'd said it in the barn, deliberate, and it stopped him the same way. "What are you actually afraid of?" The question sat between them in the cold morning air. Her father looked away, looked at the fence line she had spent years maintaining, looked at the barn, looked at the property that would not have survived the last decade without the daughter he had spent that decade not seeing. "I don't know how to—" he started, stopped. "How to what?" He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she knew. She had always known it as the thing he did when he was about to say something he didn't have words for. "You were always here," he said, "and I didn't—" Another stop. The words were not coming easily, and she could see him fighting with them, and she waited because she had learned that waiting was sometimes the most powerful thing you could do. "I didn't appreciate what that meant until you weren't here anymore." The porch was silent. "That's not what the lawsuit says," she said. "The lawyer said it was the right move," he said. "Protecting your interests." "My interests are protected," she said. "My name is on the deed. I put it there. I read every word before I signed it." She looked at him steadily. "If you file that petition, it will fail, and it will cost you money you don't have, and it will end whatever chance we have of being something to each other after all of this." Her father looked at her, the complicated face, the layers shifting. "And if I withdraw it," he said. "Then we have a harder conversation," she said, "about what it's actually going to take for you to look at me the way you should have been looking at me for 26 years. He didn't answer right away. A wind came across the yard and moved through the grass and rattled the loose section of the east fence, the same section she'd been repairing for years, the same section nobody else had ever touched. Her father heard it too. She saw it in his face, the recognition of what that sound was and what it meant and why it was still making that sound after all this time. "I'll call the lawyer," he said. "Today," she said. "Today," he said. She put the letter back in her pocket. She looked at her father for a moment longer, at the man he was, with all his failures visible and unremedied and not going to be fixed by a single conversation on a cold porch. And she thought about what you did with something that was broken and also yours. You didn't throw it away. You figured out how to carry it differently. "I'll come for dinner Sunday," she said, "if Mama's cooking." Her father nodded. Something moved through his face that she hadn't seen in a long time, or maybe had never seen. Something that was close to relief, close to gratitude, close to the feeling a man has when he has given something back he has not earned and knows it. She got back in the truck. She drove back to the ranch. When she got home, Cal was coming out of the equipment barn, and he looked at her face as she got out of the truck and said, without preamble, "Handled?" "Handled," she said. He nodded and went back inside. Silas was in the office. He looked up when she came in. She hung her jacket on the hook by the door and sat down across from him. "He's withdrawing the petition," she said. Silas was quiet for a moment. "What did you say to him?" "The truth," she said. "That's usually enough if you say it clearly." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. The office was warm, and the papers on the desk were the next thing on her list, and the list was long, and she was tired in the way you were tired after something had been resolved that had cost something to resolve. "You all right?" Silas said. It was a simple question. He asked it simply. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, and because she had decided early in this marriage that truth between them was not optional. "Ask me again tomorrow." He nodded, pushed a folder across the desk. Patterson called. Crow's lawyer reached out. "They want to negotiate." She opened the folder. She went back to work. Crow's lawyer was a man named Whitfield, who had a reputation in the county for being expensive and effective in roughly equal measure, and he opened the negotiation by sending Patterson a 12-page letter that was, as far as Mara could tell after reading it twice, an elaborate way of saying that his client was willing to talk but wanted everyone to understand that he was doing so from a position of strength and not necessity. Patterson called it posturing. Mara called it a starting point. She sat with Patterson on a Wednesday afternoon in the ranch office with the original 1987 deed and the water board filing and Whitfield's 12 pages arranged in front of her, and worked through it the way she worked through everything, not from the conclusion backward but from the facts forward, asking what was actually true and what was just noise someone had dressed up to look like truth. The actual dispute, stripped of the legal language and the 30 years of accumulated grievance, came down to three things: access frequency, maintenance responsibility, and a small parcel of land on the eastern boundary where the creek curved and the deed language became genuinely ambiguous rather than just tendentiously interpreted. "The parcel is the thing he actually cares about," she told Patterson. "Everything else is leveraged to get to the parcel." Patterson looked at his notes. "The parcel has been Crow land in practice since the mid-90s. "In practice," she said. "Not in deed. If it were that simple, he wouldn't have sent 12 pages. What do you want to offer?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it the way she thought about the water table and the pasture rotations and the feed weights, not emotionally, not with the satisfaction of having been wronged and wanting to extract something for it, but practically. What was the outcome that served the ranch? What was the outcome that lasted? "The parcel for a permanent easement on the creek access," she said. "Proportional use written into the agreement with specific numbers, not general language. Shared maintenance split 60-40 in our favor given the historic usage imbalance, reviewed every 5 years. She paused. "And a formal acknowledgement from Crow that the 1994 summary was not an accurate representation of the original deed. In writing, filed with the county. Patterson looked up from his pen. He'll resist the acknowledgement. I know, she said. It stays in anyway. It might cost us the whole agreement. Then we go to court, she said. We have a strong position. Patterson, I didn't find that original deed language to trade it away for a quiet settlement that leaves the county record wrong. If Crow's family spent 30 years operating under a misreading, the record should say so. Patterson was quiet for a moment in the way he went quiet when he was deciding whether to argue a point and had concluded it wasn't worth the effort. All right, Seth, he said. I'll send it. Silas, who had been sitting in the corner chair throughout the meeting in the particular way he sat in meetings now, present, engaged, but giving her the table, said when Patterson left, "The acknowledgement is going to make this harder." "Yes," she said. "Is it worth it?" She looked at him. A deal that lets the wrong version of events stay on the record isn't a deal. It's just a postponement. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. All right. She gathered the papers. How's the north fence situation? Cal's crew finished the east section yesterday. The northwest corner is still a problem. I'll go out Friday, she said. You don't have to. I want to see it myself, she said. I learn the property better when I walk it. He didn't argue. That was one of the things about Silas that she was still, 3 months into this marriage, finding her way around. The absence of argument, where argument might be expected. She had grown up in a house where resistance was met with dismissal, and she had learned to brace for it automatically, and every time she braced and it didn't come, she had to recalibrate, which was a small and ongoing adjustment that she suspected would take a while longer to stop needing to make. The Sunday dinners at her father's house had resumed. Not warmly, not easily, but they resumed, which was itself a kind of statement. The first one had been stiff in the specific way of people who have said true and irreversible things to each other and are now learning how to exist in the same room with those things present. Her mother cooked too much, which was what her mother did when she was nervous. Her father said less than usual, which for him meant very little, which in practice was nearly silence. Celeste was there, which Mara hadn't entirely expected, and the two of them had sat at the end of the table they'd always shared and talked about things that had nothing to do with Silas, or deeds, or county politics, and it had felt not normal, nothing was normal, but functional in a way that was its own small relief. Silas came the second Sunday. Her father shook his hand at the door with the deliberate grip of a man who was not entirely comfortable with what he was doing, but was doing it anyway, and Silas shook it back without any visible opinion about the deliberateness, and they went inside and sat at the table and the meal happened. Her father asked Silas about the north pasture fencing, which was a neutral subject that was also a real subject, and Silas answered without performance, and somewhere in the middle of it, her father looked at her, just looked, across the table, and she held his gaze and he looked away first, but not in the way he used to look away. In a different way. The way of a man who is in the middle of understanding something and knows he's in the middle of it and isn't sure where the other side is. She let him be in the middle of it, some things you couldn't rush. It was the third Sunday dinner that Celeste asked to speak to her alone after the meal, and they sat on the porch in the cold, the way they used to sit on the porch when they were teenagers, and the adults were still inside, and the night felt like something that belonged to them. Thomas Henley asked Daddy about me, Celeste said. Mara knew Thomas Henley. His family ran cattle on the western side of the county. He was 30, unremarkable in most ways, the kind of man who would make a reliable and uninspiring husband to someone who wanted reliable and uninspiring. What did Daddy say? She asked. He said yes before asking me, Celeste said. Mara looked at her. Celeste was looking at the fence line, the same direction their father always looked when he didn't want to look at something directly. What do you want? Mara said. Celeste was quiet for a moment. I don't know Thomas Henley. I know. What do you want, Celeste? Her sister turned to look at her. She had their mother's face more than Mara did, softer in the features, easier in the expressions, but there was something in her eyes right now that Mara recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror. The look of someone who has spent a long time being decided for and is in the early stages of understanding that this is a thing that can be refused. I want to be asked, Celeste said. Then say that, Mara said. To Daddy? Who else? Celeste looked back at the fence. He doesn't listen to me the way... She stopped. Say it, Mara said. The way he started listening to you, Celeste said. Not jealousy in it. Something more tired than jealous. The exhaustion of watching a door open for someone else that has never opened for you. Mara thought about what to say. She thought about what had actually happened to make their father listen to her, which was not one thing but an accumulation of things, and not all of those things had happened the way anyone would have chosen. You have to say the true thing clearly, she said, and you have to be ready for him not to like it. That's all? It's not easy, Mara said. But it's all. Celeste was quiet for a while. The cold came in off the flat and moved through the grass and rattled the east fence like it always did. Did you like him, Silas, when you first agreed to it? I didn't know him, Mara said. I trusted my read of him. That's different from liking. Do you like him now? Mara looked at the dark beyond the porch light. It was a question she had not put in those exact words to herself before, and putting it that way made it feel more exposed than she was quite ready for. Yes, she said. More than I expected. Celeste nodded. He looks at you the way... She stopped again. I used to wonder what it would feel like to have someone look at me that way. Someone will, Mara said. You don't know that. No, Mara agreed, but I think you need to stop letting Daddy pick them. Celeste let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. Almost. I'll talk to him, she said. Tell me how it goes, Mara said. They went inside. The kitchen was warm and their mother was washing dishes and their father was reading the paper in his chair. And it was, in its limited and imperfect way, the family Mara had always had. She was learning to hold it as it was rather than as it might have been. That was ongoing work, and she expected it to remain ongoing for a long time. The Crow negotiation dragged through most of July. Whitfield pushed back on the written acknowledgement exactly as Patterson had predicted, and for 2 weeks the thing sat in a standoff that looked like it might collapse, and Mara held the line on it even when Patterson called on a Thursday to say he thought they should consider dropping the acknowledgement clause in exchange for better maintenance terms. The maintenance terms are already good, she said. Keep the acknowledgement. Patterson. If Crow's position were as strong as his lawyer is pretending, they would have let this go to court. They're still at the table because the original deed is clear and they know it. The acknowledgement stays. A pause. I'll hold. Whitfield sent a counter 3 days later. The acknowledgement was reworded, softened, hedged, but present. It was in the document. It was on the record. She accepted. Patterson called to tell her. Crow signed this morning, he said. You got the creek access, the maintenance split, and the acknowledgement. What about the parcel, she said. Crow keeps the parcel. Good, she said. That was what she had offered. She had gotten what she'd wanted by offering the things she'd known he'd take. Thank you, Patterson. I've been practicing law for 31 years, Patterson said. You should think about it. I'll keep that in mind, she said, and hung up. She found Silas in the equipment barn doing something to a hydraulic line that had been causing problems for a week. He was on his back under the machine, and she could only see his boots and the lower half of his legs. We settled, she said. A pause. All of it? Everything we filed for. Crow keeps the parcel. Silas rolled out from under the equipment. His face had a streak of hydraulic fluid across one cheek, and he looked up at her from the ground with an expression she had seen on him before, the one that was still adjusting to the reality of what it had turned out to mean to have her here. The acknowledgement, he said. In writing. Filed Monday. He stayed where he was for a moment, looking up at her. Then he said, You didn't back down. No. He sat up, looked at the hydraulic line, not at her. My father tried to resolve that water issue twice, he said. Gave up both times. A pause. 11 years I let it sit. It wasn't the right moment before, she said. That's generous. It's accurate, she said. You needed someone who could read the original document without the history of it sitting on top of them. You couldn't do that. I could. She crouched down beside him so they were level. That's what a partnership is. He looked at her. Up close like this, she could see all the places where he was not the composed, controlled man the county saw. The tiredness at the edges of his eyes, the way the 41 years showed differently in rest than in motion. He was not a simple man. She had known that from the barn in March. The more she knew him, the more true that became. I want to tell you something, he said. All right. He was quiet for a moment, choosing. He was a man who chose his words carefully, not because he was calculating, but because he had learned that words deployed carelessly caused damage. He'd then have to spend energy managing, and he was conservative with his energy, the way good operators were conservative with everything that mattered. When I came to your barn that morning, he said, I had prepared for you to say no. I know, she said. I'd worked out that there was maybe a 30% chance you'd hear me out at all. What made you come anyway? He looked at the hydraulic line. I watched you for a long time before that morning. The county meetings, the way your accounts ran versus your father's, the way you moved through a room full of people who were pretending you weren't there. He paused. And the storm, watching you in that storm. He stopped. I decided that if there was any chance at all you'd consider it, the 30% was worth taking, that I'd regret it if I didn't. She was quiet. I'm not saying any of this to be... He stopped again, started differently. I just want you to know that I wasn't taking a risk on an idea. I was taking a risk on you specifically. And I want you to know that everything I've seen since has been... He looked at her. I was right. That's all I want to say. I was right, and I want you to know I know it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, You had hydraulic fluid on your face for this entire conversation. He reached up and touched his cheek, looked at his hand. Something moved through his expression that she hadn't seen from him before. A laugh that didn't quite make it out. Something held back but present. A lightness that sat underneath the steadiness. Did that ruin it? He said. No, she said. It helped, actually. She stood up and handed him the shop rag from the workbench and went back to the house, and she was most of the way across the yard before she realized she was smiling, and she did not try to stop it. The summer social was in the last week of July. She had been aware of it as a horizon since Dorothy Marsh's visit in May, the event where, as Dorothy had put it, there would be a proper introduction. She had filed it away with everything else she'd been filing and had not thought about it with any particular anxiety, which she recognized was either confidence or avoidance, and she wasn't certain which. She wore a dark blue dress she had found in a shop in Laramie on a day she'd gone in for a land survey appointment. Not the catalog kind. Something real, the kind that had been cut for someone who was actually shaped like a person. She had looked at herself in the fitting room mirror for a long time, at the hands that could not be disguised, at the shoulders that carried what they carried, at the woman who had looked back at her from mirrors for 26 years without ever quite looking like she belonged in the frame, and had thought, all right. Silas, when she came downstairs, looked at her with the same expression he had for particularly useful information. You look... Don't, she said. I was going to say ready, he said. She looked at him. He was in a dark jacket that fit him the way good things fit people who don't think too much about fit, which was well. All right, she said. Let's go. The Calverton Summer Social was held every year at the Hanover property, which was large enough for the purpose and had a barn that had been converted to something that was neither quite a barn nor quite a venue, but worked as both. People she'd known her whole life were there, which meant people who had known her as the Whitlock daughter. The invisible one, the one who smelled like a barn, the one nobody had expected to be standing where she was standing. Dorothy Marsh found her within 10 minutes. Dorothy was accompanied by two women Mara recognized as County Wives Association fixtures, and she approached with the expression of someone who has come to reassess a verdict she'd rendered under incomplete information. Mrs. Granger, Dorothy said. Mrs. Marsh, Mara said. Dorothy's eyes moved over her with the same assessment they'd given her in May, and Mara held still for it the way you held still for a medical examination, not defensively, not performing, just present. The water rights settlement, Dorothy said. It's been the talk of the county. I imagine it has, Mara said. Victor Crow hasn't lost a property dispute in 20 years, Dorothy said. He didn't exactly lose, Mara said. He got the parcel he wanted. He filed an acknowledgement with the county record, Dorothy said. Victor Crow does not file acknowledgements. Mara held Dorothy's gaze. The original deed was clear. It just needed someone to read it. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. There was something in her face now that hadn't been there in May. Not warmth exactly. Dorothy Marsh did not traffic in warmth, but a recalibration of the kind that had been happening all around Mara since March. The slow adjustment of people whose assessment of her had been based on the wrong information. You'll sit with us at dinner, Dorothy said. It was not a question. Thank you, Mara said. She found Silas 20 minutes later talking to two ranchers from the north end of the county and extracted him without difficulty. He came easily, which was one of his qualities she had come to rely on in ways she hadn't expected. He moved toward her when she needed him to. Dorothy Marsh just invited me to sit with her, she said quietly. He looked at her. How did that happen? I stood still and waited, she said. That's all? That's usually all, she said. Harlan Busby, who had told Ruth Haber at the diner that Silas had gone soft or strange, found his way to her side sometime after dinner. He was a man in his late 60s who had the particular manner of someone who had been significant in a small world for long enough that he had confused the two things. Mrs. Granger, he said, with the smile of a man who had thought some things about her and was hoping she didn't know it. Mr. Busby, she said. Quite a settlement you put together, he said. Silas and I worked through it together, she said. Of course, of course. The smile again. Still, for someone new to the operation. She looked at him pleasantly. I imagine it seems that way from outside, she said. From inside it looked like a straightforward legal question. The original document said what it said. Busby nodded, recalibrating. Well, Granger's lucky to have found someone so... He paused, searching. Capable. We're lucky to have found each other, she said. That's generally how it works. He moved away shortly after. She let him go. Silas appeared at her elbow. Busby, he said. Handled, she said. That's your word. It's a useful word. He was quiet for a moment, then low enough that only she could hear. You know people are watching you tonight. I know, she said. Does it bother you? She thought about the dinner table in March, the wrist. Nobody asked for your opinion. She thought about the barn and the storm and 26 years of being the person in the background of every room she'd ever been in. No, she said, and meant it. Let them look. The evening wound down the way these things wound down. Gradually, people peeling off in ones and twos as the night got cold, the barn emptying until the remaining people were the ones who wanted to stay and the ones who were waiting to be the last to leave so they could say they had been. In the truck on the way home, she took off her shoes, which were not work shoes and had been doing what non-work shoes did to feet over the course of a long evening. Hurt? Silas said. Worth it, she said. He drove. The night was clear and the stars were the particular stars of the high plains, an excess of them, and the road ran straight through the dark. Cal told me something today, Silas said. What? Said the hands have started coming to you first when there's a question. She looked out the window. She'd noticed. She hadn't been sure if Silas had. Does that bother you? She asked. No, he said. I told him it's because you give cleaner answers. She was quiet for a moment. You didn't have to tell him that. It's true, he said. The ranch came into view around the long curve and she looked at it the same way she'd looked at it on their wedding day, as a destination. Something that was hers and not just something she'd arrived at. There's something I've been thinking about, she said. Tell me. The east parcel's beyond the creek. Now that the water rights are settled, they're viable for a cattle rotation we haven't been using them for. If we adjust the schedule in September and bring in the right number of head, she stopped. I worked up some numbers. I want to go through them with you. He didn't say wait until tomorrow. He didn't say it's late or you've been on your feet all day. Tonight, he said. Tonight, she said. He pulled into the yard and cut the engine, and they sat there for a moment in the quiet, the ranch dark and still around them, and she thought about how strange it was that the life you'd been working toward could arrive in a form so different from anything you'd imagined and still be exactly right. Not perfect. She didn't want perfect. Perfect didn't last. But right. This was right. They went inside. She found the numbers she'd written up. He read them without comment, asking 2 questions, both of which cut to the actual complexity she'd been wrestling with, and she thought not for the first time that she was going to keep being surprised by him, and that this was one of the better things she had not anticipated about her life. The September timing works, he said. If we bring in 40 head to start. 50, she said. He looked at the numbers again. 50, he agreed. She made a note. Outside the window, the ranch was dark and quiet and entirely theirs. It was close to midnight when she finally closed the folder, and she was tired in the specific way of someone who has spent the day doing a dozen different kinds of work and has none of them left undone, which was the best kind of tired she knew. She stood up. Silas was still at the desk, looking at the East parcel map she'd pulled out during the conversation. Go to sleep, she said. You have the early water check tomorrow. So do you, he said. I know, she said. I'm going now. She was almost to the door when he said her name. She stopped. Thank you, he said. For today. For all of it. She turned around. He was looking at the map still, not at her, which for some reason made it easier to hear. Don't thank me, she said. We're partners. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. The particular sounds of a working place at rest, the creak of the house, the distant movement of cattle, the wind. And she thought about how long she had gone without knowing what it felt like to be in the right place, and how it was not a grand feeling, nothing like she might have imagined. It was simply the absence of the wrong feeling. And after 26 years, that absence was the most extraordinary thing she had ever experienced. The 50 head they brought into the East parcels in September did better than projected. Not dramatically better. This was ranching, not a fairy tale, and the land had its own opinions about what it would and wouldn't give in a given season, but better by a margin that showed up clearly in the October numbers. And when Mara put those numbers in front of Silas on a Tuesday evening, he looked at them for a long time without saying anything, which was the way he responded to things that confirmed what he'd already half believed but hadn't wanted to say out loud until the evidence was in. We expanded in spring, he said. 70 head, she said. Not more than that until we see how the creek access holds up through a full winter cycle. Agreed. She closed the folder. Outside the office window, the last of the September light was going flat and orange over the pasture, the kind of light that made the land look older than it was, or maybe exactly as old as it was, which was very old in a way that working on it every day made you forget. Cal knocked on the doorframe. He did that now. Knocked. Which he had not done in the first weeks, when he'd simply appeared in doorways with information and waited to be addressed. She didn't know exactly when the knocking had started. Sometime around July, she thought, around the time the water settlement had come through and she'd gone out to walk the northwest fence line, and he'd come with her without being asked, and they'd covered 3 miles mostly in silence, and she'd asked him at one point what he thought about the East parcel rotation, and he'd told her, plainly, without any of the careful deference she'd been getting from the other hands, and that had been the beginning of something. Water trough in Northfield is frozen, Cal said. Early for it. I'll check the heating element tomorrow morning, Mara said. If it's the element, we have a spare in the equipment barn, second shelf, east wall. If it's the line, we need to call Jensen. Cal nodded. I'll look with you. He left. Silas was watching her with the expression she had long since stopped being startled by, the one that said he was still, periodically, surprised by the specific texture of what he'd built his life around. She had come to understand that this was not a problem. It was simply what it looked like when a person who had lived alone for a long time discovered that sharing a life was different from what they'd imagined it would be, and that different did not mean worse. The hands trust you, he said. Some of them, she said. Pete still thinks I'm temporary. Pete thinks everything is temporary. He's been here 8 years and still won't store his tools in the barn because he might need to leave in a hurry. She looked at him. Are you serious? Dead serious. She considered this. I'll talk to Pete. You don't have to fix Pete. I know, she said. I want to. He shook his head, but there was something in it that was close to fond, or what fond looked like on a man who had spent 41 years being sparing with it. The Sunday dinners at her father's house had evolved by October into something that more closely resembled a real meal between real people than the careful reconstruction of normalcy they'd been in May and June. Progress was the wrong word for it. Progress implied a line, and what was happening was less linear than that, more like a field that floods and recedes and floods again, slowly depositing something different where the water had been. Her father had withdrawn the lawsuit. He had done it quietly, no announcement, no ceremony, the way men of his generation did things they were ashamed of, by simply making them stop without naming them again. She had not pushed him to name it. She had decided that what she wanted from her father was not a confession, but a change, and a change was something you watched for in behavior over time, not in a single conversation. The change was there. It was small and inconsistent, and sometimes she came to Sunday dinner and sat at that table and felt the old weight of the old dynamic sitting on her chest like weather, and she had to remind herself that the dynamic was different now, even when it didn't feel different. Her father asked her questions now. Not many, not always the right ones, but he asked. He had also, sometime in August, fixed the grinding pump. She had noticed it the third Sunday after it happened, the silence where the noise had been, and had not said anything, and her father had not said anything, and it had sat between them as the kind of communication that doesn't need words to be understood. Celeste had talked to their father in July. She had not told Mara the details of the conversation, only the result. Thomas Henley had not come calling again, and Celeste had started taking a bookkeeping course by correspondence, which she had apparently wanted to do for 2 years and had not done because there had always seemed to be a reason not to. She was not transformed. She was still the kind of person who needed the room to like her, who still tilted her head when men talked to her in the particular way she'd been tilting it since she was 16. But there was something underneath that now, a layer that hadn't been visible before, something she was building in private and hadn't named yet. Mara watched it without comment. Some things needed to grow without being looked at too directly. The kiss happened in October. She had not expected it to happen the way it did. She had thought, in the abstract way she thought about emotional things, which was to say, not very often and not for very long before redirecting herself to something concrete, that when it happened, it would be a decided thing, a moment where something shifted clearly from one state to another. That was not how it went. It was a Tuesday. She had been out since 6 a.m. dealing with the water trough situation that had turned out to be the line and not the element, which meant Jensen had come out and she and Cal had worked alongside him in the cold for 3 hours, and by the time it was resolved, she was frozen through and mud-streaked, and in the kind of mood that came from having handled something necessary and unpleasant without complaining about it. She came into the kitchen and Silas was at the counter making coffee, actually making it, not just waiting for it to appear, which was a thing he had apparently always done when the house was empty, but had initially stopped doing when she arrived because he'd been unsure of the new choreography of the space. And he turned and looked at her, at the mud and the cold in her face, and the way she was holding her left hand, which she'd banged against Jensen's equipment and which was sore in a dull, persistent way. Bad, he said, nodding at her hand. Fine, she said. Bruised. Nothing structural. He put down the coffee and came over and she let him look at it. Held it out flat, which was not a natural thing for her. The holding out, the allowing of someone else to assess something she'd already assessed. He turned it over carefully. His hands were warm, which she noticed because hers were not. It'll swell tonight, he said. I know, she said. He didn't let go of her hand right away. He was looking at it, at the scar from the wire that had been there since March, at the newer bruising across the knuckle, at the hands that had never looked like what people thought hands should look like. You should wrap it, he said. In a minute, she said. He looked up. They were standing close the way you stood in a kitchen when the kitchen was meant for one person, and there were two of you in it, and she could see all the places where he was tired and all the places where he was warm, and all the small familiar things she had been accumulating about his face for 7 months without fully accounting for the accumulation until right now. She didn't plan it. She wasn't certain who moved. It was one of those moments where afterward you could not reconstruct the exact mechanics of it because you hadn't been keeping track. You had been present instead, which was different. What she knew was that he kissed her, or she kissed him, or they kissed each other in the particular way of two people who have been moving towards something slowly enough that when they arrive, neither of them is surprised, and both of them are. It was not elegant. Her hands were cold, and she had mud on her jacket, and the coffee was making noise behind him on the counter. It was brief. When they separated, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "The coffee's going to burn." He reached back without looking and adjusted the burner. She went to wrap her hand. She sat at the kitchen table with the bandage roll and thought about what had just happened, and what she thought was, that was a long time coming. And also, I should have better predicted the timing. And also, underneath both of those, something that was not a thought so much as a feeling she didn't have a word for, but that she recognized as important, warm and certain, and a little frightening in the way that things you actually want are frightening because now there's something to lose. He brought her coffee without being asked, set it in front of her, sat down across from her with his own. They didn't talk about the kiss. Not because it was awkward, it wasn't, which was itself remarkable, but because there wasn't anything to say about it that needed saying. It had happened. It was real. The rest of it would accumulate the way everything between them had accumulated, slowly, in the course of actual days through work and disagreement and the 10,000 ordinary moments that were the real material of a life. "I want to talk to you about Harlan Busby," she said. He blinked. "Right now. He's been overusing the county road through our north boundary, and it's damaging the drainage on the east edge of that field. I want to send him a formal letter." Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee. "All right," he said. She drank her coffee, and they talked about the letter. And outside the window, the October morning was going its own way without them. And it was, as far as Mara could assess it, exactly the life she had chosen. November brought the first real cold, and with it the county's annual review of agricultural operations, which was the moment each year when the numbers that had been living in ledgers and folders became public record. Mara had known it was coming. She had been preparing for it since September in the specific way she prepared for things she expected to matter, not anxiously, but thoroughly. The Granger Ranch numbers for the year were the best they'd been in a decade. She knew this because she had the previous decade's records, which she had gone through in her first month the same way she'd gone through everything, carefully, without a conclusion already in hand. The East Parcel rotation had contributed. The Benton brothers' renegotiation had contributed. The water settlement had opened access to creek-adjacent land that had been functionally unusable before. None of it was dramatic. All of it was consistent, and consistent was what lasted. Patterson called to congratulate her. She told him the numbers were the result of existing assets being used correctly, which was true, and also the part nobody wanted to hear because it meant the opportunity had always been there. The county heard about the numbers the way the county heard about everything. Ruth Haber processed the relevant filings, and the relevant people saw them, and within a week it had made its way through every table at the diner and most of the places in between. Mara knew it had fully arrived when Dorothy Marsh called the ranch directly. "The Hanover property is considering selling," Dorothy said without preamble. "Their eldest doesn't want to run it. I've been asked to identify parties who might be interested in a conversation." Dorothy did not explain why she was calling Mara rather than Silas. She didn't need to. They both understood. "We'd need to see the land survey and the last 5 years of operations records before we'd consider a conversation," Mara said. "I'll have them sent," Dorothy said. "Thank you, Dorothy." A pause. "You've done well," Dorothy said. It came out in the particular tone of a woman who gave out compliments the way a bank gave out loans, rarely and only when warranted, and with the full expectation of accountability. "We've done well," Mara said. Another pause, slightly warmer than the first. Yes, Dorothy said. I suppose you have. She hung up and looked at the phone for a moment and then went to find Silas. She found him in the barn. Not the equipment barn, the original barn, the old one, the one that had been there since before his father's time, and that he came to occasionally in the way some people came to quiet places when they needed to think. She had figured this out around month 2 and had decided it was a thing she would not encroach on except when necessary. This felt necessary. She stood in the doorway. Dorothy Marsh just called. He looked up. The Hanover property. You already knew. Jim Hanover told me last week. I was waiting to see how it came to us. She considered this. And now you know. It came through you, he said. Does that mean something to you? He stood up from where he'd been crouched, checking something at the base of the old stall partition. He was in his work clothes, mid-morning, nothing formal about the moment. 6 months ago, Dorothy Marsh would have called me and told me to bring you to the meeting so she could look you over, he said. She called you first. Mara was quiet. That means something, he said. It means she's practical, Mara said. She saw that the numbers are good and she recalibrated. People recalibrate because they have reason to, he said. You gave her a reason. She looked at the old barn, the boards she'd never repaired, the ones he'd never repaired either, the parts that had been there so long they were part of the structure now, rather than a problem with it. Do you want the Hanover property? She asked. That depends on the survey and the operations records, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. They had the same information and had arrived at the same position from it, which was still, 8 months in, one of the things she found most disorienting about being known by someone. I'll set up a meeting, she said. She turned to go, and he said, Mara. She stopped, turned back. I want you to lead the meeting, he said. Not both of us. You. She looked at him steadily. Why? Because Dorothy called you, he said, and because you know the questions to ask better than I do, and you know it. And I'd rather we do this right than do it with the right-looking distribution of who's speaking. It was the most direct thing he had said to her about the question of how they divided things, which had never been explicitly discussed and had simply evolved into what it was. Her leading on the financial and legal questions, him leading on the operational ones, both of them in the room for everything, neither of them performing a role. All right, she said. I'll be there, he said. I just won't be in front. She nodded, went back to the house. She sat down at the desk and pulled up the county records for the Hanover property and started reading. She was still reading an hour later when she heard the front door and then Celeste's voice in the hall, which was unexpected. Celeste didn't come to the ranch without calling first, which was a boundary Mara had not set explicitly, but which Celeste had apparently intuited, and the fact that she was here in the middle of a weekday without warning meant something had happened. She found her sister in the kitchen. Celeste was still in her coat, which meant she hadn't been here long enough to take it off, or had been too agitated to remember to. She was standing at the kitchen window looking at the yard in the way of someone who has come to say something and is still working up to saying it. What happened? Mara said. Celeste turned around. Her face was the complicated one. Layers in motion, not quite one thing. Daddy had a conversation with me this morning, she said. Mara waited. He asked what I wanted to do, Celeste said. With the bookkeeping. With everything. She stopped. He sat at the table and he asked me what I wanted. She looked at her sister. He's never asked me that before. In my whole life, he's never... She stopped again. Mara felt something move through her chest. Not surprise. Not satisfaction. Something more complicated than either. What did you tell him? She said. I told him about the bookkeeping course, Celeste said, and that I want to take over the ranch accounts. His accounts. She paused. He said yes. The kitchen was quiet. Celeste, Mara said. I know, Celeste said. I know it's not... She laughed a little, shakily. It's not some big dramatic thing. It's bookkeeping for a struggling ranch. It's a beginning, Mara said. Is it? That's all a beginning ever is, Mara said. Something small that you do yourself. Celeste looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were bright in a way that was close to, but not quite tears. Do you know what he said after? when I said I'd start Monday. What? He said, time someone kept those straight. Celeste let out a breath. That's it. That's all he said. But he said it like... She stopped. He said it like it was obvious, like it was just the next thing. Mara understood. That was exactly how it sounded when their father was acknowledging something without knowing how to acknowledge it directly. He wrapped it in practicality, made it about the task rather than the person, which was a limitation and also sometimes the closest he could get. That's him saying you're capable, Mara said. That's his version of it. Celeste nodded slowly. I know. She finally took her coat off and hung it on the hook by the door, which was the thing you did when you intended to stay for a while. Can I have coffee? Make it yourself, Mara said. You know where everything is. Celeste laughed. A real one. The kind that came without effort. The kind Mara remembered from when they were young and things were simpler, and they were just two sisters in a house rather than two women negotiating a complicated inheritance of expectations. She went to the counter and made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked for an hour about nothing particularly important, which was its own kind of importance. When Celeste left, Mara stood on the porch and watched the truck go down the drive and thought about what change actually looked like up close. People talked about it like it was a moment, a door opening, a light coming on. In her experience, it looked more like the pump her father had fixed. A noise that had been there so long you'd stopped hearing it, and then one day the absence of it. And the absence was the thing that told you something had shifted. Her father was never going to be a different man. He was going to be the man he was, with the limitations he had, doing the better version of himself that his limitations allowed. That was going to have to be enough, and she had decided somewhere in the last 8 months that it was. She went back inside. The Hanover meeting happened 2 weeks later. She asked the right questions. She spotted a water rights complication in the survey that would have been a problem and addressed it before it became a negotiation liability. Dorothy Marsh, who attended as the informal facilitator, watched her do it with the expression of someone revising their estimate of a number upward. They did not buy the Hanover property. The operations record showed 3 years of deferred maintenance that the asking price didn't account for, and the sellers were not yet ready to price it honestly, which meant the timing wasn't right. She told them so directly, and the meeting ended without acrimony and with the implicit understanding that when the sellers were ready to be realistic, the Grangers would be ready to talk. Afterward, Dorothy caught her arm lightly at the door. You let a deal walk, Dorothy said. The deal wasn't right, Mara said. A bad acquisition at the wrong price undoes everything the year's work built. I'm not buying a problem to say I bought something. Dorothy looked at her for a moment. The county used to wonder why Silas never expanded, she said. Silas was waiting for the right conditions, Mara said. So was I. We found each other at about the same time. Dorothy released her arm. She was smiling, which on Dorothy's face was a precise and carefully deployed thing. Come to the winter board meeting, she said. The water committee needs someone who's actually read the original deeds. I'll be there, Mara said. The year ended in December, which arrived with the particular finality of all endings. Not dramatic, just the completion of a cycle that had been running its course whether you were paying attention or not. On the last Sunday of the year, she stood on the porch of the Granger Ranch in the early evening with Silas beside her, and the land going dark in every direction around them, the cold coming down clean from the north. And she thought about March, about the storm and the barn and the dying calf, and the man watching from the tree line in the dark. She thought about the dinner table, her father's hand on her wrist, the silence of a room full of people who had decided she was invisible. She thought about the barn on a Sunday morning, a man standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. I want to ask you something before I go in and talk to your father. She thought about what she had said yes to and what that yes had cost and what it had built. The thing about being seen, she had learned, was that it wasn't a gift someone gave you. Silas hadn't given her anything she hadn't already possessed. What he had done, what the storm and the window and the 3 years of county meetings and the Sunday morning in the barn had added up to, was simply this. He had looked in the right direction. She had been there all along. The rest of it, the deed, the water rights, the crow negotiation, her father's pump, Celeste's bookkeeping, Cal's knocked on door, Dorothy Marsh's winter committee, all of it had been her. The capability had always been hers. The conditions for using it were what had changed. That was the part people got wrong about stories like hers, she thought. They looked for the rescuer. They looked for the moment the cavalry arrived and changed everything. But there was no cavalry. There was a man who looked out a barn window during a storm and had the sense to recognize what he was seeing, and a woman who had spent 26 years doing the work without acknowledgement and was still doing it when the right person finally happened to look. She had not been waiting to be rescued. She had been waiting to be working somewhere that her work could be seen. "Cold," Silas said beside her. "Yes," she said. He put his arm around her shoulder. Not a gesture, just a physical fact, warm, present, without performance. She leaned into it slightly, the way you leaned into things that had become reliable. "The East parcel numbers came in this afternoon," she said. "I saw them." "We should expand in spring," she said. "More than we said, 80 head." He was quiet for a moment. 80? "The land can support it. I've been watching the grass recovery all fall." "You're sure?" "I'm not sure about anything until I am," she said. "Right now I'm fairly confident." "Fairly confident," he said, and she could hear in it the particular warmth of a man who has come to know the specific calibration of someone else's language and knows that fairly confident from her was about as certain got. "All right," he said. 80. She nodded. They stood there a while longer in the cold, watching the dark settle over the land that was theirs, and she thought about how much there still was to do and felt, rather than dread at that fact, something closer to satisfaction. The specific, honest satisfaction of a person who knows what they are capable of and has finally found a place large enough to use it. The pump in the north field was running cleanly. The water rights were filed. The accounts were straight. The east pasture was rested and ready. The man beside her was the right man. The work ahead was the right work. She had not become someone new. She had simply become, finally, fully herself. And that, it turned out, had been enough to change everything around her. She went inside. There was still work to do.